Hello, I'm Mark Allen, and today we have Michael John Carley joining us here at Johnson County Community College as the keynote speaker of the Kansas Autism Conference entitled Beyond the Diagnosis, Autism Across the Lifespan. Mr. Carley is a noted author and also the founder and executive director of the Global and Regional Aspergers Syndrome Partnership. He also serves as the executive director of the Aspergers Syndrome Training and Employment Partnership. Thank you, Mr. Carley, for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me, Mark.
Today we're going to start off with a little bit of, if you could tell us about what Asperger's is and where it falls on the autism spectrum.
Sure. Asperger's has traditionally been defined as a part of the autism spectrum where there's perhaps a little bit more cognitive ability as well as functional ability. The spectrum, as we know it, though, is very, very vast. You know, it ranges from all these famous people being diagnosed in retrospect, like Albert Einstein, Thomas Jefferson, Edison, Emily Dickinson, all the way to, let's say, somebody who may, not speak and lives in a home somewhere, and who is hopefully lucky enough to have a decent place to live and a clean diet and that sort of thing. But in essence, I think that the vastness of that spectrum is something that people have a hard time with. And so as human beings, we love to compartmentalize, and we've enjoyed maybe having Asperger's syndrome as thought of as a higher end and autism as the other end, but that's all going to go away with the new DSM-5 anyway. We're all going to be calling ourselves autism. In basics, though, it's really, I think, if you're coming at it from my perspective as a person with Asperger's, I think that for me, it's nothing more than a difference in processing thoughts, emotions, and experiences a lot differently than the rest of the world might. And because of those thinking differences and those wiring differences, sometimes folks like myself need to be educated differently. Sometimes we need to be managed differently in the workplace. But at the same point, there's an awful lot of potential there. There's certainly no shortage of intelligence with most of these folks. It's usually just behavioral differences, which sometimes may seem startling to other people, but the more I find that they learn about autism and Asperger's syndrome, the less afraid of those behavioral differences they are, so that long as they realize that, no, there's nothing threatening about those behavioral differences.
Now, you and your son were diagnosed about a week apart.
Correct.
And how old was your son when he was diagnosed?
He was 4.
Okay. And you were 36, is that
Correct.
correct? So how was your life leading up to that? I mean, did you have any difficulties with learning and all of that type of thing going forward, and no one told you about Asperger's, and then your son's diagnosed and then you find out? Was that a load off your, was that a load off your chest?
It was a huge load off my chest because, yes, there were differences. And I think mostly in the context of, well, that Carley guy, he's so rude, because I just didn't have that filter that other people have. And the whole concept of lying, I think, is something that is we're prone to avoid lying, not because we're better people, I think, but just because if you're going to lie, you have to have the confidence that you can get away with it. And if you are living in this behavioral minority, you're living in a world that kind of confuses you. So you don't really have that same sense of social confidence. So, we generally tell the truth a lot more, which is why I think when parents of children who are on the autism spectrum notice their child starting to manipulate them, that it's a cause for great celebration, more than anything else. For me, I was lucky because I was regarded as somebody with talents. And I think in retrospect, actually, I wasn't as talented as people actually thought I was. I was very lucky in that I was in a lot of different communities and atmospheres where there was positive iconography associated with being very different. And a lot of people on the spectrum don't have that. Furthermore, I had just lucked out in the context of being drawn into communities and vocations, as well as the people that I was thrust alongside, that really, in all my years of running both organizations, I've yet to find anybody else that was as lucky as I was for who they spent time with and where they spent time with before they were diagnosed, and how that was just the perfect recipe for somebody with undiagnosed Asperger's. Now, yes, there was a lot of people that, again, thought, oh, that Carley guy, he's so rude. But there were plenty of people who would say, oh, that Carley guy, he's a tell it like it is guy. We like him. And I'm sort of thinking in the back, I don't think either of these two camps are really right. But I'm going to go with the ones that think I'm a tell it like it is guy, because I'd rather hang out with people that like me.
Absolutely right. So would you say that amongst your research or finding out more about Asperger's, that could an ordinary citizen pick out someone who has Asperger's out of a crowd? I know that there's social cues, but could somebody just, I personally would never know that you had Asperger's if you hadn't have told me. So are there different ranges that people fall into?
Well, there's two things to consider. The first of which is that, yes, I think especially as the greater public is educated more about autism and Asperger's, yes, they are able to spot it. They're generally looking for maybe a difficulty with eye contact. They might be generally looking for some motor skills differences. They might be looking for the person that has developed differently in a social capacity and may say an inappropriate thing every once in a while, like I would. But I also think that is getting deeper and deeper into the more behaviorally pluralistic territory where we're getting better at recognize that as a general public. But coming from my end too, the person on the spectrum, we too are getting better. And I think that as the educational systems improve dramatically, what happens is that people on the spectrum learn how to navigate what we call the neurotypical world. And for me, I certainly know that, I had a real hunger to be able to succeed. And so I learned, if you'll forgive me, your ways as best I could, just like you would learn French. I certainly, I think the best illustration is that, or the parallel, is that of the immigrant. Somebody who has to learn the new ways of the culture in which they find themselves in if they're going to succeed. But at the same point, for their own sense of self-esteem, they have to retain a sense of self and understand, okay, I've learned this new language, but I also know what my original language was.
Great. Now, I understand that you testified recently in front of the U.S. Congress. Can you tell us a little bit more about that experience and what it was you were testifying about?
Well, it was the first ever congressional hearings on autism. Believe it or not, they had not done anything up until this day. And it was conducted by the House Committee on Oversight and Government Reform. And it certainly wasn't what I expected it to be. It ended up being what I would call quite a circus atmosphere. And unfortunately, it revolved around a debate which, in my opinion, was dead and buried in 2007, and that's the debate over whether vaccines cause autism. Mm-hmm. Hearing that the hearings were not just predominantly about the vaccine debate, but monopolized by the vaccine debate was really something that was discouraging and very, very disappointing to me. It was a hearing where there's one particular congressman that we know has been in favor of pushing the vaccine causes autism theories throughout his career. He's rather infamous in our circles. But I hadn't realized that there were several other House members that buy into this sadly antiquated notion that science, or real science, has proven quite faulty over the years. So it was a lot less cordial than I thought it would be. But at the same point, I think that I still have to be grateful that Congress actually held a hearing on autism, even if it was as disappointing as it was, which it was. It felt like 2 steps backward and maybe 1 step forward, but I think that it was still a step, and hopefully it'll lead to other hearings that are infinitely better informed and infinitely better emotionally healthy experiences for everybody there.
Now, you said they weren't as cordial as you had thought they would be. Towards you personally, or towards the testimony that you were giving?
Well, really towards anybody that didn't believe that, the words of Jenny McCarthy, that we all got this from big pharmaceutical companies. But I would say the most berated, the hearings were split up into 2 sections. First section had to do with some CDC or NIMH representatives. Mm-hmm. And those were supposed to last, I think, for an hour or an hour and a half at best. They lasted for 3 hours. And these poor scientists, who I was hoping would kind of fight back a little bit, were berated by members of Congress. They would be asked, why don't you know more about vaccines? And they would say, start to say, well, because the studies already proved that there's no connection, and they would be cut off. And then the same congressman or congresswoman would berate them again. That's not good enough. I need to hear more. You know, there was a fair amount of bullying going on. And luckily, there's videotape of this, and I hope everybody gets a chance to see online how astoundingly disappointing these proceedings actually were.
Do you feel that Congress was really looking to either find out if the scientists weren't telling the entire truth, or I mean, from the berating or the bullying portion of it, it sounds like that, you know, Congress was looking for their own answers, and or looking for the answer that they wanted, and they weren't getting it, and they were just going to keep going until they finally got that answer. Is that kind of the feeling that you received? My
feeling is a little different, because if you're going to ask a question of somebody, if you want the answer, you let the person answer you. Mm-hmm. They didn't do that. So I can only conclude from their behavior that this was just pandering to the audience, and pandering to an audience of mostly people who believe that vaccines cause autism because they strategically did a fantastic job. They camped out. And so none of our people who were on the autism spectrum got into the proceedings. They pretty much all had to go to a separate room because they arrive on time, but that was too late. They did a fantastic job of filling the seats with people that would, you know, hiss and boo at me and applaud, you know, people that sort of thought along their lines. Yeah, very much, when I say a circus atmosphere, I'm not kidding. And I think that there was an awful lot of pandering going on, as well as, dare I say it, politicians who really enjoyed hearing the sound of their own voice rather than looking for answers. To me, one of the saddest things about it was, one of the points that I was hoping to get across was that there is such an emphasis on government research, and I have no problem with government research whatsoever. But research is about the future. And where people are really hurting is in the present, in today. And the conversation that I tried to steer towards services just went back to the vaccine debate.
Interesting, interesting. You are the executive director of 2 different organizations.
Correct. And
the founder of one of those.
Correct.
Could you tell us more about those 2 organizations and the goals that they are trying to achieve?
Sure. GRASP, which is the one that I founded, although I have a hard time with that. I don't think you do anything great alone, and I certainly can cite plenty of other people. But it's basically the largest membership organization in the world for adults who themselves are diagnosed along the autism spectrum. And it runs just like any other chapter organization, where we have what we call peer-run support groups, where people on the spectrum, like myself, running monthly support meetings for people in, you know, Albuquerque, people in Denver, Los Angeles. We have about 27 chapters spread throughout North America. And in that context, it really does run like any other chapter organization. ASTEP is a newer organization which is really catered specifically towards employment issues. And one of the things that I was noticing all through my years at GRASP was that the employment issues weren't something that we on the nonprofit end I thought were handling very well, because I think that there was too much pressure being applied to businesses that they should hire more of our folks based only on the concept of social good, and that we weren't really taking into consideration business needs, and therefore selling our product a lot better. When I heard that there was a woman named Marcia Shiner who had spent 25 years in the financial services firm, who really understood the business language and who really understood the business needs, and that she also had a child on the spectrum and was looking to start this nonprofit, you know, I think I pretty much kicked her door down and said to her, look, you don't need me to make this happen, but I can make this happen a lot quicker for you. And what we do is we really keep it employer focused. It's not like a service agency where people on the spectrum come knocking on our door looking for a job. We don't do that. That'd be reinventing the wheel. What we do is we work with corporations utilizing what their needs are to try and get them to kick the tires a little bit, you know, and test out maybe what having employees on the spectrum is like. And I think also trying to help a lot of the human resource departments of the larger corporations to handle, let's say, their behaviorally quirky employees, where sometimes the social problems wind up as complaints on their desk. If you're a large company and the prevalence numbers are now 1 in 88, you already have people on the spectrum working for you. You just may not know it. Mm-hmm. There's really three categories of employees that these companies might have. They might have somebody who is diagnosed and disclosed, and that's wonderful because then you can manage them while talking about their diagnosis so that they become, a working partner with you to find solutions. And then you have employees that are diagnosed but haven't disclosed. And those are, legitimate situations because maybe the employee just doesn't feel the trust that they need from that environment or from that corporate culture to be able to reveal, such vulnerable information. And then you have the employees, the bachelor Uncle Freds, let's say, who are not diagnosed. Even they don't know what they've got. Now, because of the new ADA laws, however, it's completely illegal for an employer to say to somebody, hey, I think you have Asperger's. So they need to be able to spot the employee who may have Asperger's, not necessarily tell the person that, but still they can manage that employee differently using different management tools that will work a lot more successfully with an employee on the spectrum. And so we really work with employers to try and educate them about things like that, as well as increase their hiring practices.
Great. Now, as the keynote speaker of the Kansas Autism Conference, what information are you hoping to translate to the attendees?
I'm hoping to give people a different sense of what the employment field is really like for folks on the spectrum, to maybe give them also a glimpse as to what corporate life's attitudes about this and how they're changing. There's a tremendous amount of pressure right now for diversity and inclusion strategies amongst a lot of corporations, and that's wonderful. But within diversity and inclusion, you have a whole host of, let's say, partners in that particular area. You have gender, you have race, you have sexual orientation, and then you have this hodgepodge of things called disabilities. Now, disabilities is really, I think, the more intimidating cloud for businesses because if you were to have inside corporations, if they have a support group, they call it usually an employee resource group or an ERG. And if you have an ERG for your Asian American employees, okay, those are all going to be very different people, but they're still going to have that common bond to be able to share about what it's like to be the minority Asian person working in this corporation so that they can kind of commiserate with themselves. That justifies the actual existence of that ERG and makes it a useful tool for everybody involved. But if you were to have an ERG for disabilities, you might end up with a couple of vets that have returned from Iraq, 2 people in a wheelchair, and 1 person with Asperger's. And there's really not that same sort of symbiotic bond that they're all going to be able to relate to one another in. Mm-hmm. So disabilities is something that we have to sort of chop down. And we can start by chopping it down with first visible disabilities, wheelchair. You can see the wheelchair. You know that person has a disability. And hidden disabilities, such as Asperger's, where the individual has the opportunity to hide it from people if they so choose. I mean, people might guess, but they don't have to, confirm any suspicions. And that's where disclosure and the idea of coming out and saying, this is what I have, becomes an actual subject, is with hidden disabilities. So when we break it down and to try and demystify, I think, for parents and for service professionals, what the corporate experience is going through, I think that makes parents and service people infinitely better advocates for their children, for their clients, with the businesses that they deal with. So we're hoping to sort of give them a lot more productive strategies to use in their own lives and in their own fields. I think one thing that else, that I'd been realizing through GRASP was that too often, in our nonprofit field, we had books being written by clinicians about employment issues, when those clinicians really had never spent a lot of time working in those fields. And even some individuals like myself on the spectrum writing books about employment issues who hadn't, been lucky enough to hold down a job for a very long period of time. And those books are wonderful in outlining some of the don'ts that'll get you in trouble. But they lacked the experience to understand some of the do's, some of the strategies, because they just hadn't spent that time. And I thank my partner, Marcia, because she's really, the one that I think has that to be able to sell these ideas to those corporations.
Well, wonderful. Well, speaking of books, you have a book out, Aspergers from the Inside Out. Can you tell us a little bit more about your publication?
Sure. Aspergers from the Inside Out really, I think, came out of a need for a book for adults like myself who were being diagnosed in retrospect. And there were tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, happening at the time when I wrote it, which was 2006 or 2007. In essence, it really was a book that just kind of poured out of me, because it's more infused, I think, with the experiences of all the adult stories that I've heard in my years running GRASP than in any first-hand basis. I certainly sprinkled the book with some personal experience in there, but Tony Attwood is a guy that probably has dealt with more people on the spectrum before they get diagnosed or during their diagnosis, but not because I'm anything special or doing my job all that well, but simply because of the nature of my job. I have arguably heard more stories from adults after diagnosis than anybody on the planet. And I think that this book was really just a purging of the need for those stories to be told in sort of a comprehensive literature type of manner for those adults. Now, obviously, there's going to be a hidden market in parents of children whom they suspect might be on the spectrum, friends of people whom they suspect might be on the spectrum, because obviously the whole notion of approaching this with another individual is a very delicate matter. And that individual's reception to such ideas is going to be based on, you know, each person as an individual. But before the book, there just really was nothing for those recently diagnosed individuals, and so I was very happy to provide that to whomever enjoys it.
Where can the general public pick up your book?
Pretty much anywhere. You know, every once in a while I check the Barnes & Nobles when I'm there. My book seems to be there, you know. You can also buy it online at a very cheap price on Amazon right now. The book is 4 years old, so, you know, the price gets reduced in that. And it was always a paperback, so it was never going to be a pricey book to begin with. There's also, I think, a link to that through the GRASP website, which is www.grasp.org. And just to get ASTEP's website in as well, that is www.asperger-employment.org.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining us today and taking time out of your busy schedule. I appreciate that, and I know that all the attendees at the conference are going to really enjoy everything that you have to say.
Mark, thank you very much for having me.
I'm Mark Allen for JCAB News. Thank you very much for tuning in.